It is that the longing to go home to a real culture is also a longing not to be alone anymore. They who are cut adrift in time are like survivors of a shipwreck, each clinging to his own spar or beam. They who are at home in culture dwell in something that spans the generations and renews them, throwing bridges across the divides of class and sex and age. Anthony Esselin, Nostalgia. Welcome to Vintage Americana, exploring and restoring rural American culture. I'm your hostess, Holly, and today we're going to talk about moving back to our roots. And we're going to do it through the lens of our heroes. We all know the origin story of Superman. Launched in a rocket by his parents from his own dying planet, found as an infant by Jonathan and Martha Kent, raised in Smallville, Kansas, and taught the values of Middle America. And while that wasn't part of the debut of the character in 1939, Superman remains the first and most iconic superhero. We seem to instinctively understand that part of what makes Superman Superman is that oh-so-wholesome upbringing by salt-of-the-earth people. Smallville is canon to the Superverse. It even inspired an entire series, Smallville, that went on to become the longest-running science fiction series to date. Smallville introduces all sorts of conflict into the life of a young Clark Kent, because that makes for good stories. But, fundamentally, the show gets a lot of things right. Let's compare and contrast a couple of quotes from Clark and his best frenemy, Lex Luthor. Clark's perspective? Just because I'm moving ahead with my life doesn't mean I'm letting go of everything that came before. Indeed, everything that came before makes Clark into the man who can be Superman. And Lex's take? I don't care about the past. I believe in the power to reinvent yourself. And haven't our heroes been reinvented and reinvented and reinvented over and over again, but at an even more rapid pace for the last decade or so? Often not in a good way. For some reason, the people creating what passes for entertainment in the modern age seem to think that having actual heroes is a bad thing. Oh, they'll throw us an anti-hero now and then, someone who does the right thing for the wrong reasons. But it's considered so utterly unreasonable to be a genuine hero these days that they've all been given a downgrade. Everything has to be more gritty and realistic. Captain America, secretly a member of Hydra? Thor loses his hammer? The attitude is that because the sort of heroism demonstrated by characters like Superman and Captain America is unobtainable for mere mortals, they should be changed to be less heroic so that they don't make readers feel badly about not living up to the standard that's been set. But that defeats the purpose of a hero. They're supposed to be larger than life, better than we are. Flawed, yes, but those flaws put them into a position to be forced to make a choice, and making the right choice underscores their heroism, flaws and all. At a time when even superheroes are being downgraded to avoid giving the audience anything to live up to, unless they are faultless, insufferable pixie ninjas like Captain Marvel, who is, thereby, completely uninteresting as a character, it was refreshing to see a bit of a different take presented in the new Superman TV show on the CW. Superman and Lois takes our hero back home to Smallville. Family in tow, he returns to the farm and to the town he grew up in. Clark and Lois even decide that it's a better place to raise their sons, although that turns out to have some consequences too. Spoiler alert. Hit the 30-second fast-forward button if you haven't watched and plan to. Poor Smallville, bearing the brunt of yet more teenage superheroes trying to learn to harness their powers. The show even returns Superman to his roots more fundamentally. A nod is given to the Action Comics issue in which the character first appeared, letting us see the original supersuit on a live-action character for the first time ever, and even incorporating the car from the cover of that first book as a fun Easter egg for fans. Why? Because where we come from makes us who we are. Whether we are real people or fictional characters, our backstories are important. We cannot, however we might want to, simply hit the reset button on our past and pretend that it never happened. Even for fictional characters, this doesn't work. The audience knows when the new story doesn't ring true with what they know about that character and where they came from, which is why reboots often fail. On the other hand, a character that has returned to his roots often finds a brand new audience. Authenticity is a word that has been bandied about for a solid decade and a half now, pilfered by the hipster set to try to give depth and connection to whatever niche item they're trying to sell. It's something that most people can sense and respond to. I'm not talking about the faux authenticity of building your personal brand. I mean the genuineness that comes from being who and what you are. The trouble comes when people who are unhappy with who and what they are try to simply, a la Lex Luthor, reinvent themselves. Sometimes this means moving away to a place where no one knows them, making drastic changes to their physical appearance, declaring themselves to be something they are not. And it never works. It's a house of cards. Because the hair dye, the tattoos, wardrobe change, or declarations of status don't actually change who we are. Lex Luthor is wrong. We cannot simply reinvent ourselves. Which is not to say that we cannot change, but changing ourselves is a lot of hard work. Ask anyone who has ever given up a bad habit, and then amplify that to include not just a single behavior, but trying to alter patterns of reaction and response. It's not easy. Superman was never meant to be a dark and gritty character. He was intended to be a point of light in a dark world. When he first burst on the scene at the end of the 1930s, the Great Depression was still grinding people down. War was on the horizon. We had reached a point as a culture where even folk heroes were not enough to lift our spirits anymore. What, after all, could Paul Bunyan do in these conditions? What help could be had from John Henry or Pecos Bill? Those characters had developed as a way to tell ourselves inspiring stories about things that happened in our small corner of the world. Paul Bunyan might come to the aid of loggers trying to clear a jam. Pecos Bill could be emulated to quash fear of rattlesnakes. But what could they do in the face of nationwide crises? Hence, Superman, and the entire pantheon of superheroes that followed. In comics, radio and TV shows, and movies, they showed us how to be better. Until they met an audience that didn't want to be better. Being better is work. Therefore, we must make our heroes lesser. We must go even further than that. We must make the people who want us to be better into the enemy. Thus does Jordan Peterson, the Canadian psychologist who advocates the hard work of being a better person via his 12 rules, become the model for the villain Red Skull in the new Captain America, who parodies them with his 10 rules. Now, I don't hold out a lot of hope that as a show, Superman and Lois will be much better. The character of Jordan is so devoid of any ability to take responsibility for his own actions that I want to reach through the screen and slap him. But the idea of returning to Smallville, that's something I can get behind. Returning our heroes to the place that made them, Maybe so they can be reconstructed back into what made them heroes in the first place. But it needs to be a Smallville somewhere between the Norman Rockwell version of the 1980s movies and the overtly depressed place in the new show. Neither is a reflection of the real Smallville, if there can be said to be such a thing. All of this taps into a deep sense of nostalgia. Go cue up Way Back Home by Bob Crosby and the Bobcats. If you've stuck with me this long, you've probably at least heard of the Fallout video games. This track is on the soundtrack of Fallout 4. In fact, I'll leave you a link in the show notes on the website to a YouTube playlist of vintage music to include this song as performed by his brother Bing. When I say nostalgia, I'm not talking about a simple, wistful longing for a world that never was. I'm talking about the Greek understanding of the word. It means, literally, the ache for the return. Not just homesickness, although it has that flavor. Nostalgia encompasses an understanding that we are not home. Not really. We're pilgrims on the way. Not Plymouth Rock pilgrims, but more like medieval pilgrims traveling to a shrine, singing hymns as we go. Try picking up Chaucer, or that Anthony Esselin book, Nostalgia. It can be exhausting, putting one foot in front of the other day after day, and so we search for a safe harbor. We long for home. Although home may not be the house we grew up in, we long for a home. But so often we get it wrong while we search. Finding home requires a number of things. First, we need to find a place we love, and then we need to love it. The real divide developing in this country right now isn't right versus left, as it's pitched to us by both sides and the center. It's more nearly the rooted, grounded people who want to build a secure life, set against the shiftless, grasping strivers who pursue nothing but status and power. Put that way, we recognize the conflict as one we've seen in stories, time and again. Our heroes want nothing but to be allowed to go on about their lives in contentment. But those who strive for power over others disrupt that placid existence, forcing our heroes to fight. Usually, that fight comes to a head when the hero's own home is threatened. We are always strongest on our own ground. That means we need to find that ground which is our own, a place in which we fit and which fits us. I remember reading James Rebank's book, The Shepherd's Life, and in it his description of walking up a trail to the fells where the sheep graze in the summer, and his realization that his ancestors had done the same thing in the same place for 4,000 years or more. Now, very few of us can claim this sort of deep familial and cultural connection to the land on which we stand. And we have become so very mobile that it's hard for some of us to wrap our heads around the idea at all. Sometimes the place in which we live simply does not resonate with us. The town I grew up in, went to school in right up through graduation, was never really home. I had no extended family in the area. When we went to do things with our family, we went to other places. Even the church we attended was at least a 25-minute drive away. And so, like so many people, when I finished school, I left. And once I was through with my college years, I didn't go back to that town. Instead, I headed back to the west side of the state. Although I didn't know it when I first started making day trips out to interview for jobs and check out the area, it's the region where some of my family first got their start in America. And it just felt more like home. Now, I have not managed to lay hands on any ancestral land. Some of that belongs to shirt-tail relations still. Another parcel is now a subdivision. There are some pretty old outbuildings, but it lies right along a freeway that's since been built, so I can't mourn too much, even if great-great-grandma's grave is still somewhere there on the farm. Side note, it's not the best idea to go scout a subdivision for a grave marker and tell the people who live there what you're looking for. It turns out some people find that creepy. I have yet to find that marker. Although it's maintained by the township, it's not in an obvious spot. When I have the opportunity, I'll stop by the township office and ask. Still, to this place I do have a connection. I don't know yet whether the parcel of land we've purchased will develop into home for years, decades, or generations. But maybe. I do think it's much easier to love a place when you own a piece of it. Ownership is important, psychologically. This is the idea behind employee-owned companies. And lack of ownership is why rental properties often suffer so much from the destruction and neglect of their tenants. In my ever so humble opinion, connection to the land is important. I don't go quite as far as Wendell Berry, attempting to rebuild an agrarian economy that does base its premises on rose-colored nostalgia. But who knows what useful balms to body and soul we are exposed to when we take off our shoes and stroll barefoot through the grass of the place which is home. We are happier and healthier when we acknowledge and move with the rhythms of the seasons. Trying to use artificial light and climate control to make night the same as day and summer the same as winter creates exhaustion in body and mind. This does not mean that I'm against electric lights or air conditioning. I like both quite a lot. But it means that we're most content when we acknowledge that summer is for long twilights, hard work outside in the sun, and cool showers, cold drinks, and crisp, clean sheets at the end of the day. Iced lemonades and ice cream cones, bright, dewy mornings, and getting the garden weeded before it gets too hot. While winter is the quiet season, curling up with a good book or knitting while lamb shanks braise all day in the Dutch oven. Brisk trips outside and returning to the house to warm up under a blanket with a mug of cocoa. Calling it a night early because the sun has been down for hours. Turning every day into a replica of the last one, but for choice of outerwear, really does wear down the psyche. Then, once we found our place, comes the second element, finding our community. We've lost so much of this. We've traded real live neighbors for, quote-unquote, our tribe on Tumblr. And we do it because we're trying to reinvent ourselves. So anyone who knows who we used to be must be ejected from our lives and replaced with people who affirm our choices, whatever they may be. There are problems with this. The first is that virtual community is not real community. It is, at best, a parasocial relationship. And these virtual communities are easy to walk away from, which is why people who have no other communities cling to them so fiercely. If you have built your reinvented identity in such a way that your only friends are those of your virtual tribe, you will do anything and say anything to stay in their good graces. Which explains 90% of the stampeding mob nonsense of social media. Real communities are physical, and they can only be physical, which isn't to say that they might not use email or social media to communicate between physical meetings or to set them up. But face-to-face interaction is so important. Home cannot be home in a vacuum. Or, like the place where I grew up, it is never really home at all. Nor can you just find a piece of land, buy it, move in, and expect community to find you. It will require some effort on your part. You might first find where that community operates by looking online, but make sure that you find one that does gather in person. We forget in our supercharged, always-on, text message-based world just how powerful a thing it is to break bread together. Why do we, when we get a chance to get together with a dear friend, often meet for lunch or dinner? Because there is a deeply abiding development of connection involved in sharing a meal. This is why dinner dates can be so awkward, and why office parties frequently employ alcohol to try to wallpaper over the lack of real conviviality. There is a reason that real communities use meals to bind themselves together. Potlucks, pancake breakfasts, spaghetti dinners, fish fries, ox roasts, ice cream socials. I do believe the summer will bring a return to these activities, come what may. Our politicians are largely members of that rootless, greedy overclass who don't understand any kind of connectedness. So they do not understand the degree to which our interconnectedness begins to wither when we are prevented from these activities. We need to return to them again. Open houses for the graduate with cake and ice cream, weddings and baby showers, all the things that strengthen social bonds. Even we who live them sometimes forget how important these rituals are. I remember when I was planning my wedding, Dad suggested that he could just give us money and skip the whole thing. I gently refused. Now, my wedding was not a horrendously expensive, magazine-worthy event filled with 400 people who I barely knew. It was a short ceremony at the church, followed by a meal together with family and friends. And, as I pointed out to Dad, I'm about to vow to stay with him for better or worse till death do us part. There may come a day that I need a gentle reminder. And the people who were there to hear the vows are implicitly agreeing to someday provide that reminder. That's what a wedding is, and why we have them. I know, I have an old-fashioned soul. It's part of my charm, along with my humility. But weddings are a rite of passage. They say to the community, we are stepping into full membership in society. Largely because the fundamental unit of a community is the family. Single people, however hard they may work, are not a fully functional piece. The erstwhile bachelor remains a strain on the resources of the community. And it is only with the building of a family that you have committed to the long-term success of the place where you live. Community building can start with the parents of your friends' kids. It can start with a church. For this purpose, I recommend avoiding megachurches. Even with assigned small groups, it's never really a church family in any significant way. Anything over about 100 families is probably too large to be that family. Growth is good, but bigger is not, in this case, inherently better. I think the same can be true for schools. My mother still gets frustrated with me because we'll run into someone, speak for a few moments, and part again, and she'll ask, "Who was that?" Someone I went to high school with. What's her name? Really don't know. And Mom at this point usually has a small fit at me. How, she demands, can you not know? Mom, for her part, knew all of her high school classmates. All 60 of them. She can also remember most of the class or two above and below. She knows many of the people in the graduating classes of most of her 4 sisters, and can rattle off which siblings of her own were in the same class as siblings of her classmates. That is community. I had a class list, for whom I recognized perhaps 75% of the 300 or so people on it. Some of this, again, is because I was never home there, and I didn't really make an effort to be a part of that. I never ran for student council or otherwise participated in anything that would have introduced me to them. But 300 or 500 or 700 students to a class has long since ceased to be any kind of community at all. So look for smaller groups. That quilt guild I used to attend, which would have worked better if it hadn't been an hour from our home as well. The story in itself mostly related to who had a meeting on my one day off so that I could go. If you're starting a little homestead, try to meet others doing the same thing. Maybe put up a little flyer at the Farm and Fleet store. Check out the county fair. Is there something you could volunteer to judge? Stop by the local historical society and see if they need help organizing materials or leading tours of the museum. The very last piece of the puzzle is to remain always careful not to value place so highly that everything else starts coming after it. This, after all, is not our true home. We're pilgrims on the way home. The home we make here is a waypost, a temporary resting place. Don't love your place so hard that you ruin your relationships over it. And resist the temptation to fall into what I have come to regard as the trap of the Benedict option. If you are unfamiliar, this is a book by Rod Dreher that encourages us to leave the world behind and form intentional communities of like-minded folks, insulated from the things that occur outside it. This is really nothing more than the mirror image of the false virtual community. We are part of the wider world. We cannot build ourselves a bastion to protect us from it. Instead, one way or another, we need to learn to live within it. Ahead of us lies a fork in the road. Will you buy into the false notion that it's possible to reinvent yourself simply by believing that you are that which you wish to be? Will you reject everything and everyone around you who reflects back instead the image of who you are, and then turn to fake communities who affirm your choices like bobbleheads, so long as you also affirm all of theirs? Or will you decide that it's time to return to Smallville, to go back to, or find anew, those places we can learn to love, to be a part of community that can give our souls rest on the journey home, to engage in the give and take with people who know who we are, who do offer correction when we're wrong, and inspire us to do the hard work of really changing into the people we want to be. It's time to go back to Smallville. It's time to go home. Are you coming?